Jan, go ahead and take it away.
Alrighty. Thank you, Jason. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. And like Jason said, this is a little high level. We're going to get into some nerd knobs or some details, but not too much. It's a big topic, and we can take it as deep as we want. So, if there is something that you want to talk about specifically, don't be afraid to ask questions. If we can't cover it today, maybe we could do a future topic and just a specific portion of Wi-Fi security that you want to cover. But so for today, I kind of broke down into three main sections, and we'll start with protecting your credentials. Um, so, what are some things we should be aware of when we're trying to control who can authenticate to our wireless networks? And then we'll jump into protecting your data. How do we protect the data of our users while it's in transit over our Wi-Fi networks? And then we'll kind of finish up with protecting your infrastructure. And here we'll kind of talk more about the actual wireless infrastructure, the APs, the network itself, and how do we protect that. We will have a Q&A section at the end, but don't feel like you have to wait until that. Right? Use the chat, the Q&A, how we always do in SCUG. Come off mute if you want to just come up and ask a question. That's not a problem at all. Please interrupt me. But to start, whenever I talk about Wi-Fi security, there's a question that kind of comes to my head. And that question is Wi-Fi inherently not secure? And when this question does come up, and I've seen it be asked several times or seen it others talk about it, a couple stories come to mind. And the first story comes from my wife. One day she told me a story about how one of her friend group, how one of the moms had a baby monitor, a Wi-Fi baby monitor, and it got hacked, and somebody was using it to spy on her kids. And so obviously it's a pretty scary story. And her friend group was in a frenzy and not very happy with this. And the conclusion they kind of came to was it's the Wi-Fi portion of the baby monitor that got hacked, right? It's don't trust the Wi-Fi, get wired baby monitors, don't get Wi-Fi baby monitors. And so, my wife comes to this or comes to me with this, and she asks, "Hey, is this true? Is this really a thing? Should we not get Wi-Fi baby monitors?" And when I did a little bit of digging, what actually happened in reality was that this baby monitor was a cloud-enabled baby monitor. So it had like a browser-based portion to it where you could log in from anywhere and check on your kids and see how they're doing with the monitor. And so what happened was that the friend of my wife, the mom in the story, she had been using 1Password for many different services or many different sites, and that password had become compromised. And so that person got access to that password, and one of the things they got access to was her baby monitor, right? So in reality, the story had nothing to do with the Wi-Fi, or the hack had nothing to do with Wi-Fi. It was just a password that got compromised on a website. And then the second story that kind of comes to mind is in a more professional setting. This one took place at work in a boardroom, and one of the top network manufacturers was presenting to an organization that was considering moving to a Wi-Fi first environment. So it was a team full of executives and engineers, and the manufacturer was just presenting their solution to say, hey, this is what your network could look like if you move to a Wi-Fi first environment where everybody's connecting over the Wi-Fi um, rather than just connecting to a switch. And so the meeting is going pretty well. They're kind of wrapping up towards the end. There's a time for comments and Q&A. And one of the engineers, one of the veteran engineers at this organization that was considering this move, he stands up and he goes, I don't know about this whole project. I don't trust the wireless. I think Wi-Fi is too insecure for us to rely on it in this way. And so the common thread of both stories is that I think that sometimes a general distrust of Wi-Fi, whether that's from just the general public with conspiracy theories or just stories going rampant, or even from professionals and network engineers that just don't trust the Wi-Fi. But then to get back to that engineer's question, did he have a point, right? Is Wi-Fi really too unsecure to rely on it? Is it inherently not secure? And the truth is, by its very nature, Wi-Fi actually is inherently not secure. And that's because it's a broadcast medium, right? We broadcast it out over the air. See, in our wired connections, when we use our switches, our data, our ones and zeros, we send it out over a copper wire or maybe glass like in fiber. And that data is contained to the piece of copper or glass. And we don't really spend a lot of time worrying about the security integrity of that cable. We're not really worried that somebody's going to tap in and steal the data. But with Wi-Fi, we are literally sending the data out through the air, right? So those ones and zeros are all around us. So if you walk into an organization that has Wi-Fi, if your company has Wi-Fi and you walk into the building, then you literally have ones and zeros bouncing all around you. And you can't really control where those ones and zeros go. So, the question is, does that mean we shouldn't use Wi-Fi? Is it really, inherently not secure enough so we can't rely on it? And this slide is a little tongue in cheek, but the answer is no. We can't not use Wi-Fi. It's not 1999 anymore. We can't afford to not use Wi-Fi. Right? 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I think Wi-Fi was really more of a luxury for most organizations. Right? Some people were dipping their toes in it, but it was still a luxury. Today, though, it's a requirement. It's a business requirement. Our users demand it. Our business demands it. So we better get good at securing it. Now, the good news is that we've learned a lot in the last 20, 25 years, and we'll go through some of that of how has Wi-Fi security improved to the point where maybe we can use it. Right, our protocols have improved. Our general approach to Wi-Fi has improved. So, in fact, my personal opinion is that we can make Wi-Fi connections today more secure than our wired connections. So, our wireless networks can be more secure than just a wired connection. But there's a caveat, and the caveat is when configured correctly. And so that'll be kind of the focus of what we go through today at a high level. What are some things we should know of? What are some things we should be aware of so we can configure our Wi-Fi networks correctly, and then hopefully have secure Wi-Fi networks. And so we'll start with protecting our credentials. And we have here kind of a table going over the four major kind of Wi-Fi security suites from the original WEP or WP EP to WPA3 today. Now, we could, like Jason said, we could spend 20 hours on Wi-Fi security. We could spend 1 or 2 hours easily on just the stable alone and just digging deep into what all this means and why WPA3 is better than, WEP. But I do think there's a couple things we can kind of highlight. And one of those is just kind of take you through the history of where we started and where we are today. And so we'll start with WEP. And I will say WEP is one of the, I think, major culprits to why a lot of engineers today don't trust Wi-Fi. They just still remember what Wi-Fi security was with WEP, and they just haven't forgotten. Now, WEP, it had good intentions. It was the IEEE's attempt to introduce security to Wi-Fi, right? It came out around the same time we had the original 802.11a and B, but unfortunately, it was flawed from basically the very beginning. For one, it only really required a 64-bit key, and that was just too small. The only method of authentication was PSK. That's pretty crappy. The hash wasn't very good. The CRC32 wasn't very good. It was pretty weak. And then probably the biggest flaw was the encryption algorithm, RC4. That was hacked almost instantly, almost right away after it got released. In fact, it was so bad. So once WEP got ratified and released, it was so bad that the Wi-Fi Alliance realized almost right away, oh crap, we need something to replace it in the meantime, while the IEEE was working on a new 802.11i security standard. And so that's how we got the original WPA. It wasn't an IEEE standard. It was just something the Wi-Fi Alliance threw out to say, hey, we need to improve on WPA while the real standard is getting ratified. And it did improve on WEP in some ways, right? For one, the key size was increased. We now had to use 128-bit keys. That was better. RC4 was bolstered rather with some security features from TKIP. So that was nice. And then maybe the biggest thing is for authentication, 802.1x was introduced, right? We no longer just had PSK. We now had .1x in wireless. But still, even WPA, it relied on that RC4 algorithm, and it was not very secure. But luckily for us, like a year later, that's when the IEEE actually ratified that 802.11i standard. That's what the Wi-Fi Alliance called WPA2. So it was an actual IEEE standard, and we had WPA2, and it increased or improved on WPA in a lot of ways. In fact, we've been using WPA2 for really almost 2 decades now, right? So we finally got rid of the RCO4 algorithm and TKIP, replaced it with CCMP with AES, which is a great algorithm. And we've been using it, like I said, for almost 2 decades, right? So sometimes people ask me, "Is
Hey, Jan.
yep, you had a question?"
There was a question in chat actually, about, is it similar security methods in LTE? Are they different? Um, is one inherently more or less secure in terms of protocols and so forth? Just how does Wi-Fi security compare to LTE security? I don't know.
To LTE, that's a great question. Um, so me personally, I don't know LTE too well. I have dabbed my toes in a little bit from other people that I know that um, are proponents of using LTE. So there's a couple camps that recommend or like the use of private LTE in organizations. And I think there's a space for private LTE either alongside Wi-Fi or even in replacement of Wi-Fi. One of the things that they do say is that LTE has better security than Wi-Fi. Unfortunately, like I said, I don't know LTE too well, so I've just listened to a couple of webinars of people saying that, but I haven't really done the research to figure out and find out. Okay, just because people say LTE is more secure, how is that true? So I've just heard it be said. I just don't know specifically the reasons why.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, I don't know myself. I just haven't really done any corporate LTE, and I don't have any accounts that I can think of that are doing corporate LTE, but it's actually a great question. It's probably something that it would be good to get an industry expert to kind of
I
talk
would love
to.
that.
And I'll see if I can track something down, Kent. No promises, but we'll keep looking. Go
A
ahead,
great
Jan.
question, Kent, because that is something I've been interested in as well. I just honestly haven't had the time to jump into it. But yeah, Jason, if you can make that happen, that'd be awesome. I'd love to sit and hear somebody talk for an hour and a half on LTE and especially private LTE. That's a great question. So I think I was just about to jump into kind of why. So we had WPA2, and why do we even need WPA3? Right, we've been using WPA2 for 2 decades, really, with almost very few issues. So why even the need for WPA3? And the answer to that question is there have been a couple of issues with WPA2. Right, it hasn't been perfect. It has a few weaknesses, and for the kind of the major one, I think that spurred I think WPA3 a little bit. Um, was a vulnerability that was discovered in 2016, kind of late 2016, early 2017, and that was the crack attack or the key reinstallation attack. And that's where an attacker could um, force a vulnerability by so basically during the initial association authentication process and when the access point and the client begin to talk to each other and do that four-way handshake to say, okay, hey, here are my keys, here are your keys, let's encrypt our data. What the key reinstallation attack would do is it would force the access point to reinstall the keys over and over and over again. And now you might say, okay, that's not a big deal. It's just reinstalling the keys. They're still encrypted. What can you do with it? Well, what the vulnerability in WPA2 is if you force an access point to do that many, many times over, right? If you force it to do thousands of times over, you can begin to see a certain pattern in the keys that are installed. You don't really know what the keys are, but you can start to sense a pattern. And even with AES, which is a great encryption algorithm, if you send enough packets with it, you can recognize a pattern enough to start to decrypt that traffic. You can figure out, hey, what is the key just based on a pattern? And I'm talking about a lot of packets. So you have to do it thousands of times. But the thing is, we know with networks, you can force a network to send thousands of packets, right? Networks send packets at blistering speed. So thousands, millions of packets isn't really a problem. And so you can use the crack attack to figure out a set of keys in as little as 2.5, 3 minutes. So that's a pretty big vulnerability. So that's one of the reasons that WP2 started to become less secure. And we said, okay, hey, we need something new. And then the other reason is the use of PSKs, right? I think I mentioned with WEP, PSK was the only form of security, and it was pretty crappy. We have had 802.1x, but we still have PSKs, right? Lots of our networks still use pre-shared keys, passwords that we all know. And in general, PSKs are pretty crappy, and we'll dive into specifically why a little deeper. But really, those are kind of the two major reasons why we said, okay, hey, WPA2, we need to get improved, right? It's been 2 decades. What can we do next? And so that's where we have WPA3, and it improves on it quite a bit, right? For one, we get rid of PSKs, or at least we enhance PSKs with something called simultaneous authentication of equals. We will really improve the encryption. The PSK's biggest weakness is with encryption, and like I said, we'll dive into that a little deeper. But there's other things, right? So we get bigger key sizes, we get better encryption. We have something called forward secrecy to um, help us with attacks that force us to send many packets over and over again. We kind of limit that a little bit. And so WPA3, going forward is our recommendation, right? That is what we should be using. WP2 has been great, but going forward, as much as possible, we should be using WPA3. But then, the question is, okay, great. I want to use WPA3, but how do I get there? And the answer is technically, if all you need is WPA3 and you have somewhat recent APs controllers, that all you really need to do is go into the configuration pane for your SSID, find the WPA mode, and find the drop down for it, and then select WPA3. Click save, and you're done. Right? It's not a big configuration thing. It's right there, but I'm being a little facetious because, as we all know, it's easy to make a configuration change. The rub really lies in, how can we do it correctly without negatively affecting performance, right? So, okay, I want to make that switch to WP3. I want to have WP3 in my network. What do I need to plan, prepare, assess to get there? And so the first thing is your network, right? We want to assess the network. And really there we're talking about the age of your equipment, right? If you have old APs, um, before 2018, right? So WPA3 was ratified in 2018. I don't think I mentioned that. So if you have equipment older than that, then you're not going to be able to do it, right? So you need APs more recent than that. I will say if you're planning a new wireless infrastructure, or if you've recently got new wireless infrastructure, then it's not going to be a problem. The answer is already there for you. And really, anything post 2018 in the wireless infrastructure world is going to be able to support WPA3. And then the other question there is, what authentication method are you using today? Um, Justin, good question. So, I mean, we're kind of covering it now too, but yeah, for wireless infrastructure, it is going to be anything past 2018. And Justin asked how many devices are WPA3 capable. So on the AP's controller side, actually some manufacturers, even like 2017, they realized WP3 is coming and they started to make devices that were compatible. And then on the end user side, it's really around the same time, 2017, 2018. So like you say iPhone, the iPhone, for example, I think anything past the iPhone 7, so iPhone 7 and on, is WPA3 compatible, can run WPA3. Anything before the iPhone 7, so iPhone 6s, 5s, 4s, they cannot run WPA3. And we'll jump into that too a little bit and kind of assess your devices. But so for your network, what kind of authentication method are you using today? Are you using PSKs, .1x, or maybe you're using an open network, right? I hope not many of us are using open networks, but there are, people are using open networks. But if you're using an open network, then the answer is pretty simple. You're not using WPA3, and you're not going to be, because uh, if you're using an open network, right, all an open network is the lack of security. So you're not running WPA2 either. You don't have any WPA. So WPA3 is not an option if you're going to continue running open, right? If you want to switch to .1x, then we can have the conversation of, okay, let's plan out for WPA3. And then the second part of this is exactly what Justin just mentioned, is let's assess our devices, right? And in wireless, half the battle, sometimes more than half the battle, is just dealing with end user devices. So I will say this is probably the hardest part of moving to WPA3 is your end user devices. They will need to be 2018 and later. You might need to update some drivers, some firmware, right? Make sure it's up to date. But if you have devices that are legacy devices, if your organization doesn't have maybe a standardized way of upgrading end user devices, then this is probably one of the biggest challenges of WPA3 or migrated to WPA3. And that kind of takes us into the transition methods, right? There's two primary methods that we can transition to WPA3. And the first one is just WPA3 only, and the other one is WPA3 transition mode. And specifically, we're talking about really end user devices, right? That's the reason we have two different methods. Transition mode being where you have both WPA2 and WPA3 running on the same network or the same SSID, same network, to try to support those devices that are legacy devices, right, that are older than 2018 or 2017 and older. And that sounds nice, but I'll be honest with you, I'm not a super huge fan of transition mode. That's really for two reasons. For one, right, in security, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if you have WPA2 and WPA3 on the same network, then that network is really only as secure as WPA2, right? If you allow WPA2 clients to get on, then you're not actually using all the security benefits of WPA3. Your security is really only as good as WPA2. So it's really meant to be very temporary. While you're in this transition mode, don't think that your network is now more secure just because you have transition mode. And then the second reason is, honestly, I've seen it not even work that well sometimes, right? The whole point of transition mode is to help our legacy clients onto WPA3. But I've seen many times where a legacy device like an iPhone 4 or 5 just refuses to connect to a transition mode network, even though technically it's supposed to support both WPA2 and WPA3. The device just won't connect, right? And you have to connect it back to a WPA2 only network, and only then will it connect. So it kind of defeats the whole purpose of the transition mode in the first place. And so that's where, in general, kind of I recommend the WPA3 only mode. Now it does take a little bit more work because what we're talking about here is having two separate SSIDs, right? So we have a WPA3 only SSID and then a WPA2 only SSID just for those legacy clients. And so we do have more overhead because now we're doubling our number of SSIDs. So maybe we don't do this for every single SSID, but it's a better approach. And the solution to it is, right, is as you have these clients connect to the legacy SSID, right, sometimes you'll have users complain to you and go, hey, I don't want to connect to this one, right? Because maybe you can name the WPA2 SSID legacy or name the WPA3 SSID, secure. And so people see that and they don't want to connect to legacy. They want to connect to secure. And they come to you and they go, hey, what the heck? I'm trying to connect to, this more secure Wi-Fi and I can't. I don't want to connect to this crappy legacy one. And that's where you can have the conversation with a user or maybe even the executive of, well, it's your device, right? Your device is too old. If you can upgrade your device, you can absolutely connect to this newer, better, more secure Wi-Fi. It's just your device isn't compatible, right? And so, especially if that the conversation is had with an executive, maybe that gives them the motivation to go, okay, hey, maybe we need to upgrade our organization's devices across the board, right? Maybe we need to I know devices that are 2018 are pretty old, right? So hey, let's get those old devices out of here and move them to newer devices so they can connect to WPA3. And then I said too is you can also kind of track of how many legacy devices you really have, because sometimes you'll have clients tell you, oh yeah, I have really old devices and I use them all the time and I bring in my this device all the time, so I can't use WPA3. And then you check the logs and you see, oh, you had like two or three devices connect to the WPA2 network over a week. And it's like, okay, well, we only have two devices, so let's get those off, let's get those upgraded, and we can get rid of the WPA2 network entirely. Justin asked another question. Warehouse scanner, I see being a roadblock. That is a very, very good point. In warehouses, this is an issue where, for the most part, I still see a lot of warehouses using WPA2 just because scanners don't have a lot of motivation to improving their products. And sometimes you're still using, honestly, I've seen scanners that are manufactured after 2018 that are manufactured in the last year or two that are still not WP3 compliant, even though they are Wi-Fi devices natively. So that is 100% true in warehouses that can be. There are, I will say, right, not all warehouse manufacturers, there are some. Definitely they're WP3 compliant, but you might need to upgrade your scanners if you want to upgrade your warehouse Wi-Fi network to WPA3. And then Kent asks,
Yep.
can you run both WPA3 and 2 SSIDs on the same AP? Yes, you can. So absolutely. Whether that's transition mode or if you want to have only 2 completely separate SSIDs, they can run on that same AP. So you don't have to have separate infrastructure for WPA2 and WPA3. You can run on the same AP, right? With a caveat that that AP is at least 2018 and newer. So if that AP can support WPA3, then it can have separate SSIDs for each security suite.
Good questions tonight. Thank you,
Yeah,
everyone.
fantastic questions.
And Justin, I think in general, you'll find that there can be challenges in any wireless technology in a non-carpeted space or an IoT type space where I have a medical manufacturer I do some work with out in Ventura County. And yeah, they, you know, their PCs and everything can run all these great new fancy protocols, but their wireless sensor for reporting pi data, maybe not so much, right? And things like that. So, uh, yeah, absolutely. There can be challenges when you're in those kind of OT or non-carpeted spaces, however you want to refer to them. But yeah, I think we're a little more focused on the enterprise, but I think these are great questions and I appreciate you bringing them up.
How many companies have you seen move to WPA3? Quite a few. So I would say more than half of our organizations that I've worked with have moved to WPA3. Again, same caveat that you can introduce and Jason just said. It depends for what networks, right? So for organizations that have those IoT devices or warehouse scanners or devices like that, I've seen them use legacy SSIDs. So you have a legacy SSID that's just for those devices or maybe just for IoT. So you'll have like an IoT SSID. But otherwise, I have seen organizations move. It can be right. I'm not going to say it's all fun and roses and it's perfect. The biggest hurdle in even carpeted space is your end user devices, and that can be an issue, right? You find out that your CFO has a iPhone 6 for some reason, and all of a sudden that's a pretty big hurdle, and now you have to figure out a way to get him off of that if you want to move to WPA3. Great questions, yeah. So I will move on to our next section. Feel free to keep asking questions, even if you want to ask questions about WPA3. While I'm talking about this, I'm happy to go back to it. But we'll move on to protecting your data. So we talk about credentials, right? So this we're going to talk about, how do we help protect our users and specifically their data while it's in transit. We talked about Wi-Fi using the air around us. How do we protect the data while it's in that air around us? And so when we talk about protecting data, we talk about encryption, right? That's really where encryption comes into play. And so we'll start with SAE. And I mentioned I didn't like PSKs, right? And so I didn't like it in WEP. And one of the nice things about the WPA3 is we're kind of getting rid of PSKs. And maybe that's not the best word. We're not getting rid of, we're enhancing PSKs. And so what we use to enhance PSK is SAE. That's a simultaneous authentication of equals. And the reason I am not a huge fan of PSKs has specifically to do with encryption. And specifically, I'm talking about keys, right? So in a pre-shared key environment, we all know we have a password, right? And so that password is usually shared to everybody and everybody knows it. And you might say, okay, that's not a big deal, right? Even if you have the password to the network, I have it segmented beyond that. You can't get off of it. It's not a big deal. But the weakness of PSK is that that same pre-shared key is not just used for authentication. That same pre-shared key is also used for our encryption keys. So when that client and that AP are talking to each other in a pre-shared key network, and they're doing that initial dance and the four-way handshake, the key that they use to create the encryption is the pre-shared key. So if you know that pre-shared key, you can absolutely decrypt all that data. And so I've done this kind of thing before with somebody where just to prove to them, just to show to them the weakness of a PSK, is I've gone into Wireshark and I've done a packet capture of their PSK network, and just to see what it looks like when a client first connects, how secure is it? And the network engineer is very proud of it because all I see is in the packet capture I see an association request, and then I see an authentication request. And then when we get to the four-way handshake, when the AP and the client are exchanging keys, after that, I don't see anything else, right? So ideally, in a network environment, I should be seeing a DHCP request, right? I should be seeing some kind of traffic after that, but all I see after that is just encryption, 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 encrypted traffic, and I have no idea what's going on. And so, I've had the network engineer go, see, you can't see anything. But then now the question comes down to is how much do we trust our pre-shared key, right? Because in most of our networks where we have a pre-shared key, that key is out in the open, so users can use it, right? We either post it somewhere, we tell users what our pre-shared key is, because we want our users. That's part of the nice thing about a PSK network is it's very easy to use. We want our users to know our passwords, and for the most part, we don't update that password very often, right? So in a scenario where maybe I'm an employee that's disgruntled, maybe I've been fired, and I want to do some harm, I know the PSK, right? And in an ideal world, we're updating the PSK every time somebody leaves, but that's just not very realistic, right? I've only seen a few organizations that update their pre-shared keys more often than a week, right? I've seen a couple that do it like daily, and that's impressive. But the vast majority of organizations, right, we use the same pre-shared key for a while, and so it's not a big deal to get access to that pre-shared key, right? It's not a big hurdle. And so if I'm trying to do damage, and I have access to that pre-shared key because I used to be an employee, and now I'm upset, and now I'm sitting in a parking lot, and I see this, same packet capture, right? So I see that packet capture, I see the initial association, and then I see encrypted traffic. All I need now is just that pre-shared key. And even using something as simple as Wireshark, right? I don't need any even sophisticated tools. Just using Wireshark. If you've ever used Wireshark to do wireless packet captures, there's a little option there to say, hey, what's your encryption key? What's your PSK? And if I type the PSK into there, Wireshark right then and there will decrypt all the traffic for me, like instantly, right there for me. I don't even have to wait. And so now, not only, okay, I see your association request, I see your authentication request. Okay, well, now I see your four-way handshake. Now I see your DHCP request. Now I see where packets go over the network. And now all of a sudden I have insight into your network. I can figure out, I can do some sleuthing and figure out, okay, what does your network look like? What are the different IP addresses of all your network equipment? And not only that, then I can also just harm that individual specifically because now I can decrypt all of his traffic and I can see that in plain text. And so if that information is, or the data is sensitive, that's a lot of damage that can be done. And so that's why me personally, I'm not a huge fan of pre-shared keys. I know they have a use and a place, but this is where WPA3 improves on that because what SAE does is it uses a different key for encryption than it does for authentication. So we still have our PSK for authentication if we want to authenticate to the network, but then SAE in the background automatically, autonomously, without our interaction, gets to the client and randomly generates a different set of keys for the encryption portion. So now, even if we have the PSK, we cannot decrypt that traffic. AES is very, very difficult to decrypt. So you can try to brute force it, you can do whatever, but you're really not going to get past it. And all of a sudden now our PSK networks are much more secure because we don't have that loss of encryption of our data. When our data is in transit, we don't have to be concerned about, oh no, anybody can decrypt it. You can't, right? We have a completely separate set of keys that are unique to every single client, right? So every AP and every client have a unique set of encryption keys that are not shared with anybody else. So I will add that SAE is required in Wi-Fi 6E. We haven't really talked about Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 6E. So Wi-Fi 6E is when we use the new 6 gigahertz band, right? So historically we've had 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. With 6 gigahertz, if you want to use 6 gigahertz, SAE is required. WPA3 is required in the 6 gigahertz band. So if that is something so I think, I forget if it was Kant or Justin had asked how many clients we see move into WPA3. We have had a few clients want to use 6 gigahertz, and just because they want to use 6 gigahertz, they had to move to WPA3, right? That is a requirement if you want to move to Wi-Fi 6E. And then the second portion to that, tied really closely to it, is something called enhanced open. Now, enhanced open is not technically part of WPA3. It is technically a standalone. And the reason for that is because enhanced open builds upon our traditional open networks. And like I mentioned before, an open network isn't WPA2 or 1 or 3. An open network is the lack of security, so there is no WPA to it. So that's why enhanced open is not part of WPA3, because open networks aren't part of any of the WPAs. And enhanced open really offers to open networks exactly what SAE offers to PSKs, and that is the introduction of encryption, right? Because in an open network, we don't have any security, we don't have authentication, we don't have encryption. All our data is just sent as ones and zeros over the air unencrypted. Enhanced open builds upon that, um, and introduces encryption, right? So another word for it is OWE, opportunistic wireless encryption. You'll see those terms used interchangeably, OWE or enhanced open, but both of them are the same thing. And the real big takeaway there is it enables encryption for open networks. So this one's a big one. I will say, Justin, to your earlier question about WPA3 uptake, we haven't seen a lot of enhanced open uptake. Um, I think that's just because in an open network, typically you're trying to, work with your lowest common denominator, and you have way less control over what your client user devices are, and you need client devices to be compatible with enhanced open. So it's going to be 2018 and on. So I think this is something that we'll see get used a lot more as legacy devices die out. But it's a lot harder to control what devices connect over an open network rather than an enterprise network. Now, I will say if you're doing an open network for just best effort, then heck, go enhanced open. If somebody can't connect, it's too bad. It's a best effort network anyway. But sometimes it's easier said than done to actually do that and deny people Wi-Fi and have complaints coming. Right, it's not always feasible. So this is enhanced open is pretty cool. Not quite here yet in terms of just uptake. I personally have not worked with an organization that said, yes, let's do it yet. I do know people that have done it, but not somebody that I've worked with. So any questions on those? Either one of those? I think they're pretty straightforward, but really a big takeaway for both of them, enhanced open and SAE, is encryption, right? Encryption is key in security, and especially when we talk about data. And that's what both of those do, is they introduce encryption to where we previously did not have encryption in our Wi-Fi. And then the kind of last topic in protecting your data is really more of like a personal recommendations or thoughts, right? Of specifically talking about public Wi-Fi, right? So when you and I are just out and about in the world, and we need to use public Wi-Fi, what should we be aware of? What are some things we can do to protect ourselves, right? Or maybe what are some things we can recommend to our employees or users when they're out in a public Wi-Fi? And so the first thing I'd recommend is use a VPN. Right? Chances are, like I said, most Wi-Fi networks today um, aren't really using enhanced open, right? They're probably still just using open, so that doesn't have encryption. So we want to use a VPN to introduce some kind of encryption for us. Since the Wi-Fi network isn't going to do it, let's do it ourselves. And one of the best ways to do that is just VPN. The second thing is be careful what network you're connecting to. So be absolutely sure you connect into the right network and be intentional, right? Be intentional when you connect to Wi-Fi networks. Don't just connect to random networks in hopes of getting Wi-Fi. And I have seen people do this. I have a couple of friends that do this. That just when they're out and about somewhere and they need a connection and their cell connection isn't great, and they go Wi-Fi hunting, right? They just try to find one of the Wi-Fi's around and that they'll connect to and hopefully get to the internet, and they'll just connect over and over again to every other Wi-Fi just to see if one of them will give them access, and that's not a good idea, right? And the reason for that is because that's a great way of connecting to somebody who's trying to pretend to be somebody they're not, right? They're running a spoof network and they're trying to trick you, or just hoping that you're not paying attention enough to connect to them and capture your data, right? If it's an open network you're connecting to and you think you're connecting to somebody, but you connect to somebody else, uh, that person can do a man-in-the-middle attack on you and figure out what you're doing. So, like for example, if you're in a Starbucks, right, make sure you connect to a Starbucks network, not just some fake Starbucks network that's been spoofed. Or if you're in an airport, make sure you're connected to the right airport. So be careful of people trying to spoof networks to you. Be intentional in that. And then tied into that,
We
kind of related.
we do have
Oh, we
two quick
do.
questions. Yeah. One from Charlie. Do you use a travel router? I'm assuming he means do you travel with some kind of device that you can kind of control what you're connecting to? I don't know if we have any
Don't, but that
plans to
sounds
do that.
nifty. That sounds kind of cool. Charlie, you have to tell us about that because I haven't really heard too much about that.
Yeah. And then Kent did ask if we had a pre-2018 Cisco WLC, can it be upgraded to be WPA3 compatible, or would you need new equipment?
So you would need new equipment. I
Yeah.
will say Cisco is one of those manufacturers that saw the writing on the wall for WPA3. So some of their 2017 um, equipment is compatible, but for the most part, you will need new equipment. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think of one that you don't, but I can't think of one. Yeah, for the most part, you're going to need new equipment. Jill, iNet makes a travel router that can use NordVPN. Your devices connect like you're at home when you're. Oh, that's pretty awesome. That sounds kind of cool. I'll have to Google that later.
Yeah. I don't think we have any clients that are using anything quite like that, Charlie, but it's a good point. And Kent, I think in general, when you're looking at that stuff, kind of a, ounce of prevention, pound of cure sort of thing. You really got to get into the data sheets and figure out like, okay, is this one of those controllers that's a little bit older, but it still supports WPA3, or is it not? So I would always say, refer to the data sheets or
Mhm.
work directly with Cisco if you're close to an account team, or work with a partner or like LA Networks or anyone else really, if you don't have the time or the wherewithal to do that sort of thing. But yeah, always checking the documentation's your best bet, even though I am completely aware documentation can be so loosey goosey sometimes. We want a specific question answered and it doesn't always do that, but those are always just general good practices. Okay, Jan, keep
Yeah,
going on.
that's one of my pet peeves actually in wireless is sometimes the data sheets aren't great, and they're really just built in. I feel like they're built by the marketing team sometimes rather than the engineering team. And you're trying to figure something out, and you're like, okay, I can't figure out that this thing supports it. So I agree with Jason 100%. For sure, ask somebody. I mean, if you know the models, I can look them up for you, or maybe I know, but yeah, that's I don't think so, but Jason makes a good point. You can definitely confirm that through data sheets or an account team. And yeah, it is for people who are road. Yeah, I can imagine, Charlie. That's it sounds pretty cool. I used to be a road warrior, definitely not anymore. So don't know that stuff anymore, but that sounds pretty cool. Just when you're visiting family or whatever, just to stay safe. And so on the topic of staying safe, so one of the other things we can do is turning off AutoConnect for our devices. Now, this is something that our devices try to do as a convenience for us. So like our iPhones or Samsung Galaxies, whatever, is they're they're trying to do us a favor and they're trying to say, hey, I've connected to this network before. So the next time I see it, I'm going to auto connect to it. So if you've connected to a Starbucks network before and then you walk into a Starbucks, your phone will just automatically connect. And actually, I had this happen today. I got a new device not too long ago. And, I created this slide and I wasn't following my own advice because I got this new device and I forgot to turn off auto connect on it. I've had it for several months and just never turned it off. And today I was at a client site, but I was at a completely different site this was a new site I've been to, but this client has sites all over the city. And so I walked into this new site um, and then realized that my phone was connected to Wi-Fi, and I was like, "What the heck? Why am I connected to Wi-Fi?" And I realized, oh, it's because they use the same guest SSID at all of their locations, and my phone, trying to be a good guy, I just auto connected to the Wi-Fi without me even doing anything about it. So I am guilty of this one. Lots of us are guilty of this one. It is, a nice convenience, but try to turn it off. And again, it's because people are smart and they try to spoof stuff, right? So if your phone remembers a Starbucks network and you're walking around the airport or somewhere else or at a venue somewhere, somebody who's trying to attack you or attack innocent passerbys, they can do that, right? They can create a network called Starbucks and spoof it. And so when your phone sees it, it goes, "Oh, I've connected to this network before. I'll jump on," right? Or in my case, this organization that I work with is fairly well known in our city, and so it's possible somebody will spoof that network, just hoping that they have tens of thousands of employees, that one of the employees is out and about, and they'll connect to this one SSID because they know the SSID. They've been to a hospital or something like that, and all of a sudden, you're in the middle of a man-in-the-middle attack, and you think you connected to, or your phone thinks they connected to this network. In reality, you connected to the attacker's network, and they're seeing everything you do. So try to turn off that AutoConnect. I know it's a helpful feature. It saves time, but try to turn, and I should do this too. I need to do it on my phone as well. Turn that off so your phone doesn't accidentally connect to something it doesn't, you know, it thinks it's connecting to. And then closely tied to that is there's another setting is forget the network before disconnect. So our phones like to remember our networks, remember our credentials specifically, right? So, for example, you go to a friend's house a lot, and they have a unique network, but it's called guest Wi-Fi or something like that, and they have a specific set of credentials, and you type those credentials in once, and your phone remembers those credentials, right? So not even a public Wi-Fi, but just even a personal Wi-Fi, it remembers those credentials. Even that can be used to attack you when you're out and about. Because if, let's say, your friend's house is a very generic name for a Wi-Fi, somebody can, an attacker can create a name like that. And when you're out and about, your phone says, "Oh, I've seen this. Let me try to connect," and type in the credentials. And the thing is that your phone doesn't understand is that person that's attacking, they will take any set of credentials, right? They say they want credentials, but they will take any set of credentials. And so your phone types it in, the AP accepts it, and your phone goes, "Oh, sweet, okay, I remember this network. I remember the credentials. I'm connected." In reality, you're not connected to that network at all. You're connected to somebody entirely different who didn't give a crap about your credentials. They're just there for your data, right? And now you're connected over an open network. You're not using a VPN, and they can see all your data. I see more questions about.
Yeah, I think I answered that one.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, for the most part, actually, I don't know. I don't know the Spectrum Wi-Fi. That's a good question about Spectrum Wi-Fi. I know that I remember reading an article at Starbucks that they were going to do that at some point. I don't know if they ever did, um, but it would be nice. It would be nice if they actually did that, but I don't know about Spectrum Wi-Fi specifically. All right, and now for our last major section, and that's our infrastructure. Right? How do we protect the actual infrastructure, our APs, our network itself, our wireless network itself? And we'll start with something that's pretty simple, but honestly very often forgotten, and that's securing our management plane. Right. So sometimes we do a great job of securing our data plane, but then our management plane is just an afterthought. We need to make sure that the security of that management plane is as robust as the rest of the network. Right. We said before, security um, is really just as good as our weakest link. So if your data plane is secure, but your management plane isn't, well, guess what? Your network isn't very secure, right? And there's been times where I've walked into a network where the engineer is very proud of their security, and then we get in their management, and they still have some default passwords in use somewhere, right? It's like, okay, let's not do that, right? That's a big vulnerability, a big attack plan that attackers can use. So the nice thing is that a lot of new infrastructure, um, it does require us to reset our default passwords. So like on first login, it'll say, "Hey, you logged in. All right, go ahead and set your password now." So that's a nice feature that some of the manufacturers have, not all of them. So that's something we should just be doing as a rule of thumb. Always update our default passwords. I know it seems dumb, but we should be doing that. And then the other tip is let's use secure protocols for our management, right? So if we're talking about WPA3 and how cool WPA3 is, let's also not be using HTTP and SNMP2, right? Or Telnet. Let's use HTTPS, SNMP version 3, and SSH, right? Let's use the best, most recent protocols for our management. And then finally, and this one doesn't get talked about very much at all, uh, but don't let your management plane be accessed via your data plane, right? So for wireless, don't let people get access to your wireless management through your Wi-Fi itself, right? So if I'm sitting on your Wi-Fi, I shouldn't be able to access your controller. Um, Now, the nice thing is that uh, this is something that historically we've done, but more recently it's kind of gotten harder a little bit, especially with the use of like cloud controllers, browser-based management portals, right? Unless you have specific rules set in place, it can be hard to say, hey, don't access, how do I say don't access the Meraki portal via the Wi-Fi? We can create some rules for that, but if we don't create rules for that, then that's absolutely something that can be done. And that's just another hole that can be used. If somebody's got an access to our Wi-Fi, we don't also want to give them access to our management portal. And then the next thing is in infrastructure is kind of two big topics. And I think to Jason's earlier point, this is another two topics we could easily spend uh, honestly 20 hours just talking about this. And in our yesterday's topic, Jason did mention that maybe we'll get somebody to talk about ICE at an upcoming Skunk event. That'd be nice because so Cisco ICE, for those of you that don't know, is a network access control solution or suite from Cisco. But so what we know, what are 802.1x and NAC? And both terms are thrown around quite a lot. I think sometimes in marketing words or just by people that use it as a buzzword but don't really understand that 1x, especially sometimes I feel being used that, it's like, I'm using that 1x, but really what is 802.1x? And it's really very simple, right? It's just port-based security through the use of EAP, right? We have three parties in that 1x. We have our supplicant or our client that's attempting to authenticate. We have our authenticator or the network device that the client is, wanting to access the data, the connection of what we're trying to connect through. And wireless, that's most often the access point itself. And then we have our authentication server that receives that authentication request and grants or rejects it. Right, that can be our controller, that can be a server. But .1x is not from a high level is not that complex, but it can get complex, right? But we do see it be widely used in Wi-Fi, right? WPA, when it introduced .1x to Wi-Fi, that was huge, and it is awesome, right? Whenever possible, we want to use that 1x for PS instead of PSKs where it makes sense. And one of the reasons is because it's just very scalable, right? Instead of with a PSK where we have to manage a password and maybe have to update it all the time, .1x, it's on a per client basis, so it can grow or shrink with us. It really is pretty awesome. It can get pretty deep though, and that's especially when we start talking about NAC, right? So network access control. When we start taking it .1x and we start using a NAC solution like a Cisco ICE or a ClearPass, there's a lot more that we can do. There is more complexity to configure it, but we can start doing some really cool stuff, right? So specifically, we can start doing more customization, right? So with .1x, we're a little bit limited into what our parameters are to allow people on to our networks. With a network access control like a Cisco ICE, we can start using different parameters, right? So different identifying factors to set custom policies that are much more granular, much more detailed than just .1x. We can begin to segment our network differently based on different criteria. We can even do device posturing, right, where we're checking on end user client devices. We're validating them to make sure they meet a certain minimum security requirements that we've set. So it's definitely a lot more to it. Like it can be a topic all on its own, right? So network access control or Cisco ICE, we can spend hours on it. It would be cool, Jason, if we could do a topic on it at some point, just talking about ICE and maybe tie it into wireless and say, hey, this is some stuff we can do with a Cisco ICE and wireless. But for sure, it's something we can dive deep in, a lot
We're
deeper than
gonna
just a high
cover,
level.
yeah, we're confirmed to cover ICE in November. I don't know the specifics on how much time they'll spend on Wi-Fi versus wired versus just the architecture and solution. ICE can be a
Sure,
real beast of a topic. It's
it
massive.
really
So,
can.
but I did get confirmation actually just today that
Oh,
that
perfect.
Cisco has a speaker lined up. So yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, so we'll make sure to ask them some wireless questions. But yeah, it like you said, ICE is more than just a wireless solution. It is a whole network solution. Wireless is just one piece of it, but there is a lot of overlap. So if you're really interested in wireless security and you really want to get more granular with wireless security, it behooves you to know ICE a little bit, or maybe ClearPass, right? If you prefer Aruba, and there's other solutions out there, right? It's not just those two, but I think those two are the ones that I've had the most exposure to. And then our last topic for infrastructure and for today is the topic of WIPs and WIDs, or wireless intrusion detection and wireless intrusion prevention. And for those of us that have some, network security experience or knowledge, both of these are exactly what they sound like. They're really just the wireless equivalent of like an IDS, IPS. Now, if you said, "Hey, wow, that's cool. I didn't know WIDs and WIPs was a thing," I wouldn't actually really blame you. It goes under the radar quite a bit, and there's a lot of engineers, even wireless engineers, that don't know about WIDs and WIPs, and that's primarily because the vast majority of wireless infrastructure, especially today, right? Like, so your Cisco's, your Arubas, they will come with WIDs and WIPs straight out of the box. Lots of the APs will have it, the controllers will have it out of the box. And you often don't have to configure anything, right? So it just comes by itself. You don't often have to do anything. It just kind of works. It's feels like magic sometimes, are pretty automated. But because of that, it can go under the radar, right? So people can forget about it, or they just don't use it or don't look at it. And I would urge us not to do that, right? So try to get into your whips and wids, figure out what yours looks like, whether it's in a portal or in a controller. And most of the time, these wids and whips functions, they will have a lot of actionable data for us, right? So even though they're doing this stuff on their own in the back end, right, they're detecting rogue APs, they're shutting down rogue APs for us, and without too much interaction for us. It's nice to see what they're actually doing in the back end, right? So try to make it a daily or weekly reminder or tasks to do item to go through the logs and figure out what are the things that your whips solution saw, right? Did it detect rogue APs? Were there security events? Were there anomalies that it saw? Because maybe if there's a pattern to it, right, just because the whips is seeing a rogue AP and shutting it down, it can be part of a bigger issue, right? Just because it did it once or twice. If you see this happening all the time and it's the same devices in the same site, then you have a problem, right? Something that you personally need to take a hold of. And as with many things with automation, automation I think is best done when it's leveraged together with human interaction. So automation throws a lot of data back at us, and we need to do something with it, especially if it's actionable. Figure out, right, if you have a security event going on at one site 5 times a week, then maybe we should go and figure out what is that security event and just stop it instead of just relying and hoping that our automated whips will take care of it for us.
There was a question on how do they shut down a rogue AP? That's a good question. How would you shut down a rogue AP through? Um,
That is a very good question. I don't know the specifics entirely. It can get really deep into physics, honestly, into how it
yeah.
works. It has to do with waves and waveforming and phase. Basically, it will send out waves that are out of phase to cancel it out. How specifically it happens, like I said, it's one of those things that's just magic. It is one of those things I'd love to know, maybe spend more time on, but it would have to be a very physics heavy lesson to figure out exactly how a whips goes in and shuts rogue APs down. But I have seen them do it, right? If you go into your logs, hopefully you're not really seeing very many rogue APs or security events, but sometimes you can see them, and you can see the whips actually doing its job and saying, "Hey, I shut this down." Right? Sometimes it can be as benign as a user thought that Wi-Fi was really bad and brought in their own Wi-Fi from Best Buy, right? And they plugged it in and they booted it up, and your Cisco controller said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, wait a minute, I don't want that," and shut it down, right? And it's very physics heavy, so we can maybe read a book one time and jump into that deeper.
Okay.
But yeah, mostly though that is kind of the end. Whips and Woods was the last portion. So thank you guys. I don't know if we've had a lot of questions, so appreciate the interaction. I don't know if we have other questions or just other topics, anything wireless. Feel free to ask.
Need help? Call our cybersecurity team and book a consultation with us today.